Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast, part 2 of our conversation with former Texas offensive coordinator Greg Davis, is sponsored in part by Compassion International, compassion.com/sports spectrum. That's the website to go to. 150,000 children are choosing to follow Christ in the last year alone because of the great people like you sponsoring with Compassion International. They do it right. Compassion works. I mean, you always want to know what to do. Where am I going to send my money? Who am I going to sponsor? And who do I trust? And Compassion is a place that you can trust. You will never regret $38 a month. They're the most trusted child development ministry in the world. 1.8 million children around the world are being released from poverty because of the great work being done at Compassion International. You can make a difference in a child's life. Go to compassion.com/sports spectrum. Sponsor a child today. Today's podcast guest is Greg Davis, former Texas offensive coordinator, part 2 of our conversation with Greg. And as I mentioned in part 1, he was the former Texas offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach from 1998 to 2010. He retired from coaching in January of 2017. He helped lead Texas to the 2005 national championship game, coaching guys like Vince Young, Colt McCoy, and Chris Sims during his tenure at the University of Texas. He also had stints at the University of Iowa, North Carolina, Georgia, Arkansas, Tulane, and Texas A&M. In part 2 of our conversation with Coach Davis, we talk about his journey to coaching and finding that guy that he can just kind of follow in the footsteps and kind of follow along with. And that guy was Mack Brown, the former head coach at the University of Texas. And we hear a great Mack Brown story in part 2, which is probably my favorite part of the podcast. But we also talked to him about that 2005 season and that Rose Bowl game, what he remembers about that Rose Bowl game. That's the famous Rose Bowl game where Vince Young and Texas squared off against Reggie Bush and Matt Leinart at USC, many calling it the greatest college football game of all time. Greg talks about why that is the best football game he's ever been a part of. And we also talk about losing. In 2009, he lost the national championship game to Alabama. That's when Colt McCoy was the quarterback, and he got hurt and ended up not playing for most of that game. And just the difference between winning the national championship and losing the national championship and how you can learn from both experiences. So I really enjoyed talking to Coach Davis. Again, it was such good stuff that we didn't want to cut any of it out, so we made it into a 2-part conversation. So here he is, Greg Davis, former college football coach, former Texas offensive coordinator. Part 2 of our conversation with Greg right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Take a listen. You and Mack Brown were kind of linked for a while there, certainly at Texas, where you were Mack Brown's offensive coordinator for 13 seasons. Tell me about that first time you came in contact with Coach Brown and just what drew you to him, and I guess how you guys formed that relationship together.
Okay. Mack and I actually worked together for 18 years total, and 13 at Texas. You're exactly right. But I was at Texas A&M, and Mack had just got the job at the quarterback job at LSU, and he called and he said, "I'd like to bring our offensive coaches over and visit with y'all and watch spring training, if that's okay." Jackie Sherrill was our head coach. Yep. We were throwing the ball probably more than most of that time frame, and that would have been probably 79. And so Mack came over with his offensive coaches, and they stayed 3 or 4 days, and they would go back to the hotel and at night and work, and then they'd show up at lunch, and we'd kind of had our business done by lunch, and we would visit for 2 or 3 hours and then go to practice, and then so that's the first time I had ever met him. But we had some very similar ideas, and then as luck would have it, we were recruiting. He was recruiting Southwest Louisiana into Texas, and I was recruiting Southeast Texas into Louisiana. So we had some crossover times in recruiting. where we would see each other and bounce ideas off each other. And so he when he left LSU, they offered me his job, which I did not take. Jerry Stovall was the head coach then. And but I called Mack, and I said, man, I appreciate that you would go to the head coach as you were leaving and say, this is a guy you should talk to. And he said, well, a minute, believe it. So when he went to Tulane as the head coach, I was still at A&M. And he convinced me to go to Tulane, which tells you he's a pretty good recruiter, from A&M to Tulane. And but he said, Greg, if you come to Tulane, you'll be the next head coach here. And he said, because we'll get this thing turned around. And so 3 years later, we had the first winning season that Tulane had in a long time. And he got the North Carolina job, and I took over. Unfortunately, we could not sustain that 1 year success. And so as he was struggling at North Carolina, especially early in his time there, I was at Tulane for 4 years, and then Arkansas, and then I was at Georgia with Ray Goff. And so he's now turned it around at North Carolina, and he said, hey, why don't you come back? Why don't you come back and join us and be my offensive coordinator and call the plays? And so that we did. We had 2 great years, I think 2 11-1 years. And then he walked in one day and he said, hey, DeLaw's Dodds wants to talk to me. What do you think? And I said, walk over there if you have to. And he said, what do you mean? And he said, we're pretty good here. We're 11-1. And I said, Coach, it's just different. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I grew up in that state. And yeah. And I said, it's just different. I mean, everything is about football there. And so Mack tells this story. You may have even heard it when he was on the interview with Coach Rawl. He said, Coach, what makes Texas such a great job? And Coach Rawl said, well, son, there's probably 4 to 5 million people that every morning wake up and the first thing they think about is Texas football. And he said, but I'm going to tell you, that's what makes it hard too. And that's right, So anyway, we went to Texas. We had 13 great years, and got to coach a Heisman Trophy winner and a couple others that, in my opinion, probably should have been. And it was fun. It was a lot of fun. I was in my home state, so something that I will always cherish.
Mack, of course, is now an analyst, a pretty good one, actually, at ESPN. Our paths crossed a few times before I left there. This is a podcast, so we have the opportunity to tell great stories, which is what I love. So why don't you tell us one of your favorite Mack Brown stories? I mean, 18 years is a long time, and it's probably hard to pinpoint one. But maybe you can come up with one that really kind of either makes us laugh or makes us think or makes us, kind of look at him in a way that maybe we couldn't before. But tell us your favorite Mack Brown story.
Well, 18 years is a long time. So there's been many. There's been many, and my favorite funny Mack Brown story.
Okay.
And Jason, if he doesn't like this, I'm going to blame you. Okay. So,
fair enough. This is my fault, Mack. I asked the question.
So you get ready.
I'm ready.
I will not take the heat for this. So we had things turned around at Texas. I don't think we'd won the national championship yet, but we were being mentioned as a team that, pretty consistently playing pretty good ball. And we go to Kansas, and it had been snowing, and Kansas was not a real good team, but they were playing better. Mark Mangino was there, and they were beginning to get it turned. This was right before they went to the Orange Bowl. Yeah. Mark did get it turned, and so all of our guys, I think 95% of our players were from Texas. I mean, we didn't have guys that played in the cold. I mean, we played in the heat.
That's right.
When you came to Austin in the summer and it was 103, it was to our advantage. Yeah. And so he was worried. I mean, it was about 31 degrees at game time. The snow had been plowed off to the side, and it was a crystal clear day. And we went out for the warm-up, and he came back in, and guys, I'm worried. I mean, in the coaches, I'm worried. Our guys wasn't bouncing around very much. It's Kansas. It's, Oklahoma was a week ago, and it's cold. I tell you what I'm going to do. And y'all don't have to do this, but I'm going out without a coat. I'm going to take my coat off. I'm going to make a point during the pregame talk that, it's all a state of mind, and I dang sure don't want you sitting over here huddled like a bunch of cows, under your sideline jackets. And so I leave to go to the press box. So I hear Mack tell that to the coaches. I later find out, that was his pregame. You've state of mind, we're going to be tough, all this. And so, I don't want you huddling over there. So we go out, and they flip the coin, and they win, and they take the ball, and they promptly go about 9 plays, 80 yards. It's 7-0 Kansas. Oof. So, their fans are excited, and so they kick off to us, and they kick it out of the end zone. We take over at the 20 at that time, and so Chris Sims is our quarterback. He walks out there, and on the first play, he throws a 3-step hitch and drills their corner between the numbers. I mean, the ball he could not have dropped it. I mean, it was stuck. And he walked in from about 20, and it's 14-0, and my hot chocolate's not cold yet. And I hear Mack over the headset turn to our equipment manager, Chip Robinson, and say, "Dang it, Chip, get me a coat. If we're going to play bad, at least I'm going to be warm."
That is great. That is great. Did you win the game at least?
Oh, 56-14.
There you go. So that was the only points they scored.
That was it.
So you proceeded to go on a 56-0 run, and Coach Mack got warm.
Yeah. So
that is a great story.
But
well, if he yells at me, if he yells about that story, then I'll take the heat. How's that?
Yeah. Well, you're going to have to. And then he tells this story that of course is cute, but this is exactly what happened. We're getting ready to play USC, and we're on the field. And I had, coaches have superstitions, and one of my superstitions was when we got out on the field, I never looked at the opponent team during warmups. Right. I never turned around and looked at them, and I know it had nothing to do with the outcome of the game, but I didn't do it. But Mack, on the other hand, Mack loved to look at him because a lot of times, later he would say, "Hey, you remember Jason? We tried to recruit him out of Tyler, Texas, number 42. I saw him over there loosening up. Whew, I think we were right about him, or he did." So we're in warm-up, and he grabs me and he says, "Have you seen their team? There's a reason they're number one." And I said, "Coach, turn around and look at yours. Ours looks pretty good too now."
Right.
And he said, "Yeah, you're right. This should be a heck of a ball game." So,
well, it was, and I was just going to pivot to that game because I think if we We're going to have a former assistant coach of Texas on during that 2005 season that you guys won the national championship. You mentioned Vince Young earlier in the conversation. That game, it goes down in college football lore as one of the greatest games ever played. I mean, they're doing documentaries on it. I think NFL Network and certainly ESPN has covered this game in a way, even looking back now 13 years later. What comes to mind when I mention that Rose Bowl? I mean, you mentioned that story, which is fantastic, but maybe just the game itself and how it played out, and Vince Young, of course, having the game of his life and scoring the winning touchdown. I'm going to ask a couple questions here. I'm not supposed to do this. They teach you in Broadcasting 101 to just ask one question. So I'm going to ask two questions. First, is that the best college football game you've ever been a part of? And then secondly, tell us about that game and kind of what comes to mind when you think back throughout and how that game played out.
Okay. It is the best game I've ever been a part of. And before some fans would say, well, what about, this Oklahoma game, or when I was at A&M, what about this Texas game where y'all beat Texas? One of the reasons is because of the stage it was on. I mean, it was the number 1 and number 2 team in August. I think I'm right in saying this, Jason. Yeah. The number 1 team and 2 team in August was the number 1 and 2 team at the end of the year. And I remember walking in after a ball game and USC's playing Notre Dame, and it's on in our locker room. Now, we've just won, and so when we're coming in, our equipment guys turned on that ball game in our locker room, and our guys are pulling for USC. And that was the Bush push, push Leinart into the end zone. You're no sports fan. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Our guys go crazy. So the fact that it was for the national championship in an unbelievable setting, and if you haven't ever been to the Rose Bowl, you need to try to put that on your bucket list. It was. So what I remember about the game is, first of all, at the 10-year anniversary, a guy called and said, Coach, can we talk about that game? And I said, sure. And he told me, Jason, so I'm repeating this. I can't fact check this, or I didn't fact check it. Yeah. But he told me out of the 22 starters, out of the 44 starters, 22 for Texas and 22 for SC, and they all wasn't seniors, obviously. Right. But out of those 44 guys, like 30 guys played in the NFL. And like I said, I didn't fact check it, but based on our team, that's pretty close.
That's a pretty good track record of how good the players were in that game.
Yeah. So it was a great setting. It was great players. It was a game that I remember my son, who coached for right at 18 years before he got out, and he called before the ball game, and he said, Dad, gosh almighty, I want y'all to win so bad. And I said, well, I do too. Mm-hmm. And he said, but really and truly, make it a great game. I mean, he said, there's so many times when all the hype and it's a dud. Yeah. And so anyway, it was a great setting. It was a great game against two great universities that had been successful, two coaches that had similar styles. I think Pete and Mack both very gifted in talking to the media, very gifted in recruiting, very an air of youth about them, young kid about them, where, not that they wasn't serious about it, but, so there was everything was set. The game itself was, I remember a couple of things. I remember more than a couple, but I remember Reggie breaking loose and trying to pitch the ball. And that was like kind of our first break in the game because they kind of got started quicker than we did. And he was running down the field and had just made 30 yards or so. And as he was going down, he tried to pitch the ball back to one of his teammates, and we got on it. That led to our first touchdown. And kind of let our guys know, okay, hey, they're pretty good, but we're pretty good. This is going to be a pretty good game. The next thing that I really remember about the game, and I think your fans will enjoy this, and this is absolutely the truth in the way this happened. Gene Chizik, who's also works now on TV, Gene was our defensive coordinator, and Gene sat right beside me in the press box. We were two coordinators that worked from the box, and he sat right beside me. And when we made the fourth down stop, and Gene was not a guy, let me lay the picture out. Gene and I were both guys that sat right side by side each other, and you probably could not have told we were for Texas. I'm totally serious. When we were in the booth, we were very unanimated. We were very analytical. We were very so. In most times, if the cameras panned up to the booth, Chiz and I were sitting there side by side. It looked like two radio announcers. But when we made that stop, he jumped out of his chair, took his headset off, threw him on the table, and looked at me and said, "We just won the national championship." And I'm thinking, there's a little work left here, Chiz, because we just stopped them on fourth down. We got to go. We got to go score. And so anyway, we do go score, and we win, and everybody's happy. And Chiz and I are in the elevator coming down, and I said, "Do you realize what you did? That when we made the fourth down stop, you jumped up, which you don't ever do. You threw your headsets down, which you don't ever do. And you said, we just won the national championship." And he said, "Greg, had you been watching the game?" And I said, "What? Yeah." He said, "They hadn't stopped the big dog all day. They wasn't going to stop him in that drive." So
great.
So
well, let me
those are stories.
I love it. We could talk all day about just about that Rose Bowl game. But I have a question that's maybe a little different than maybe you've heard before from that game. Success is such a great thing, obviously, being national champions, and you get the ring, and nobody wants that taken away. The banners are up there, and everybody talks about that year, I'm sure, whenever somebody comes in contact with you from Texas. But what's the toughest part about having success and having a season like that? Is there a tough part?
Well, yeah, there is, and I can best illustrate it with a story about Darryl Raw. And so we're flying back after the game, and Coach Raw is sitting across the aisle from me. Now, you have to understand, I grew up in Texas. Coach Raw was the man. So when I would tell my parents I had dinner with Coach Raw, they would say, "No, you're kidding. Really? You didn't." He was the guy. And so he's across the aisle from me. And so we get to that point in the flight where the pilot says, "Okay, put your laptops away and seat backs up. We're making our final descent into Austin." Well, there had not been a lot of sleep the night after the game. And and then you get up early because you have to go to another awards presentation, and then you go get on a plane. So I had been kind of trying to doze in my seat, and Coach Raw, when they make that announcement, we raise up, and he looks across the aisle, and he said, "Well, boy, you checked off the last thing on the list." And I said, "Excuse me, Coach?" And he said, "Well, when you come to Texas, they give you a list of things that you got to do. you checked off the last thing on the list last night. And I said, wow, Coach, that means a lot. And he said, but now let me tell you, when this plane touched down, they're going to give you another list. And they do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a great life story. It's a great story for everybody in sports. Businessmen, you close a big deal, it ain't over.
Yeah.
And and Coach Roll had that way of telling little stories that just were so apropos. So that's the hardest thing is trying to maintain. But I'll say this, I'd rather fight to have maintained it than not ever got there.
Right, absolutely. And I remember Coach Dabo Sweeney telling the story that, even when they won the national title a few years ago, that this wasn't going to be the greatest thing that happened to them in their life. And it was something to that effect. And that was hard, obviously, in that moment when you just won the national title and he's in the locker room telling his players, don't let this be the greatest thing that happens in your life, because he's so focused on people and things that expand past the football field. I thought that was a real good testimony as well.
Mack said the same thing. Jason.
He did, yeah.
He told the players don't let this define your life.
Yeah.
Be a better husband, be a better father, be a better citizen of the world. Don't let this be the defining moment of your life, which I thought was pretty awesome.
It's a good lesson. Just a couple more questions here. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about 2009. You mentioned it earlier in the show as well. That's a season where so much good happened, and then at the end, and Colt McCoy gets hurt, and you lose eventually to Alabama for the national title. I wonder, sort of comparing and contrasting, you win it in 2005 and you lose a heartbreaker in 2009. What did you learn? What did you take away from losing, I guess? Maybe it's the same thing, that it shouldn't define you, but what did you take away from being on the losing end of the national championship as opposed to winning it?
First of all, I have to tell a Colt story.
Please. One of the best guys I've ever met, by the way, in my time at ESPN was Colt McCoy.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would be shocked if you would not have said that.
Yeah.
Well, he gets hurt early, and obviously he can't play the rest of the game. And so when I talked to my mother later after the ball game, she said, "You should be so proud." And I said, "What are you talking about, Ma? I mean, we lost." And she said, "How many kids have you ever heard after a win say, I'd like to give God the credit, I said, "Well, I've heard that a lot."
Sure.
And she said, "Colt said it after the loss." And I said, "Do what?" So evidently, and I never saw it, but evidently they grabbed him at some point after the game, and he made reference that, all things work together for those who trust him. And I thought, oh my gosh, what a powerful, powerful witness that in the lowest moment of a young man's life, that he would say that. And it's because he meant it. It's because it was him. It's because he is the greatest kid anybody has ever met. If you're going to, Jason, if you're going to tell your team over and over and over, it's not the destination, it's the journey. It's not the destination, it's the journey. It's don't look past the next one. We're taking them one game at a time. Then I think you come away from that season with an unbelievable feeling of success. Obviously, we didn't reach the goal we wanted. I will forever feel bad about it for the kids, for the fans, but you know what? The journey was pretty impressive, and we didn't quite put the flag on the top of the mountain. And, sometimes in life you got to learn to handle that too.
Yeah, so it's a good lesson for life, right? Everything isn't always winning championships. You have to go through the valleys too. And listen, to finish second among all the teams isn't the worst valley. It's painful when you're going through it, I'm sure. But when you look back, I'm sure that there's so many good things that you could look back on that 09 team and remember. Let me finish with this. There's just a couple more questions. How hard was it for you to resign from Texas? How difficult was that?
It was hard.
Yeah.
It was hard. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And, like I said, we were 18 years. Mack and I was together 18 years. And so after the 10 season, we didn't play well. And a lot of it was my responsibility that, we had not played well enough on the offensive side of the ball. And so I understand. I mean, you work and don't quite get the national championship, and you work sometimes and things don't work well. And so Mack basically told me, hey, I need to go in another direction. And so it was hard. I mean, it was real hard. It was not only job, it was friendship. Yep. It was 18 years. It was my state. Yeah. It was my family all lived in that state, and so it was hard. But I knew throughout it that now's when they're going to look at you, Greg. Yeah. It's easy to go to the FCA conferences and things, and you win a national championship, or even you play for one and you don't get it, and it's easy to stand up there and say, God's been good to me. I've been blessed, and how are you going to handle this, big boy? And so, obviously, through prayer, and I said, God, please, give me the words, use me as a vessel to continue to say, I'm not defined by what happens on that 100-yard field. And although it is a huge part of my life, it does not define me. And so, you got to be able to act like that. And so that's what I hope I did.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then, of course, we won't have a lot of time to talk about it, but you go to Iowa, and you had some success there as well on the back end of your career. And you finish up and you retire January 6, 2017 from coaching football. So where we are now, this will be our final question, Greg, and really do appreciate all the time you've spent. What is the Lord teaching you during this season of life, this retirement season that, as you said on the very beginning of this podcast, every day is like Saturday? But what is God teaching you? What has the Lord been teaching you right now?
Well, it's just like the Man Up experience that you were a part of. I've had an opportunity now to go to those because I have time to do that. I'm going to speak at one of those next year. So I've had opportunities that have now been afforded to me, and I really have had more time to be in prayer, to be in worship, and probably the biggest thing is that I want to continue to. One of my great friends was a pastor, and when I was coaching at A&M, and he is retired now. And I used to always ask him, Frank, what's the magic line? Where do you? And he said, the book says, let your light shine, Greg. It does not say blind them. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to walk every day where somebody says, hey, you know, this guy's, there's something, he's real. He's the real deal. And and I just hope for many opportunities like this one that you offered me, and like Rich Green at Compass has offered me, and for opportunities to share how fortunate I have been over the years.
Yeah, this is first of all, thank you for saying that, Greg, and certainly the great folks at Compass Church in Colleyville are awesome, and it was my honor to be there and get to meet you as well there. But thank you so much for sharing your story, your journey. You know, I always say if we're breathing, then we still got more to share, and God's called us to do that, and you got a lot more, and this is so great. Hopefully we can catch up again and maybe even talk during the season a little college football. But thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your journey, and we wish you nothing but the best.
Thank you, Jason, and I appreciate your walk too. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And we do thank Greg Davis, former Texas offensive coordinator, national championship offensive coordinator in 2005 from the University of Texas, for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast, full of stories, right? That's what you love when you talk to a guy like Coach Davis. I mean, you could feel like you could just sit in the room for hours and listen to him tell some amazing stories. And we were grateful to have about an hour with him here on the podcast, where he shared some great insight, some great wisdom, and just some awesome stories during his time coaching. So we wish Greg Davis nothing but the best, and we thank him for joining us here on the podcast. And we also thank you for listening to the Sports Spectrum podcast. You can always reach us at Sports Spectrum on Twitter. You can always reach us at sports_spectrum on Twitter, and you can email me directly, jason@sportspectrum.com, if you have any guest ideas, or if you simply want to say something that you enjoyed about this episode of the podcast or any of our episodes. We're over 300,000 downloads now here on the podcast, just an incredible number that we never thought that we would ever reach so quickly, I guess. But God is in the business of surprises, right? And he's surprising us every single time we release an episode, and the impact that these stories and these interviews are making on the intersection of sports and faith. We also want to say thank you to our partners, Compassion International. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum. Sponsor a child today, $38. We're talking about one child at a time being impacted. 1.8 million children in 25 countries around the world are feeling the love, feeling the impact that's being had by Compassion International. This is your chance to go sponsor a child and make a gigantic impact in their life, providing them hope instead of despair, providing them an opportunity to feel the love of Jesus, to have food and tutoring, education, the things that every child should have. This is your chance to make an impact. Go to compassion.com/sportspectrum, $38 a month. Sponsor a child today. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Sports Spectrum podcast. We'll see you next time right here on Sports Spectrum. Have a great day.